Hello and welcome to part 6 of Introduction to Philosophy. I think the last lecture inadvertently I said Introduction to Sociology, which is not altogether inaccurate in my approach after all this PP&E, politics, philosophy, and economics, but this is indeed a philosophy lecture. And what we take up in this talk is the distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions. This is the second of two problems we're going to consider. We just considered rationalism versus empiricism. We're doing so as a preliminary to reading some of the primary texts, and we're doing so after having talked about the history of philosophy, the definition of philosophy, and in particular the three branches of what I've been calling P2, that academic discipline treating problems in one of three areas: metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. So that's all water under the bridge. Now here we are, analytic and synthetic propositions. And this has to do with the question, can we deny a proposition, any proposition, without contradicting ourselves? And it turns out that sometimes the answer to that is yes, and sometimes the answer to that is no. There are two distinct ways in which a proposition, if it is true, and they aren't always true, but if it is true, two ways in which it might be true. One of them is called analytic, that is the kind which cannot be denied without self-contradiction, and the other is synthetic, that one can be denied without self-contradiction. Now, of course, denying a proposition may either be correct or incorrect. The proposition may either be true or false, but at least that is a question. The proposition has some truth value which can be debated and contended over. And that is simply not true of analytic propositions in the first instance. Truth. Now there's a subject. It is conceivable that no propositions are true, or that if any of them are, we cannot know whether they are. People will sometimes say nothing is true. This is not just Fox News and Mar-a-Lago North. But what about that proposition, nothing is true? Is it true? Because if it's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's perhaps meaningless. Gorgias, an ancient sophist, Plato has a dialogue about him, allegedly said the following, put forth the following three theses simultaneously. There is nothing, and even if there were anything, no one could know it, and even if anyone could know it, no one could communicate it. Hey, where did my audience go? Not the sort of doctrine one wants to shout from the rooftops. In that respect, it's sort of like solipsism, which we took up last lecture. Inhabiting the fact-based community, is it just an option? Again, I quote Senator Moynihan, everyone's entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. Now, we hear various theses on epistemic relativism. Truth is what is true for you, says L. Ron Hubbard. Nietzsche, there are no eternal facts as there are no absolute truths. What do you mean it's wrong, the kid says to his elementary school teacher. In philosophy, we learned that truth is always subjective. Sure, 1 + 1 = 15. But Velociraptor, that's a meme floating around the internet now. Velociraptor has a question for Ron Hubbard. When people say there is no absolute truth, why are they always so absolutely sure about it? Maybe that's true for you, but it's not true for me, Velociraptor. Yes, Robert, reasonable people can have different interpretations of things, but not this thing. So, the analytic-synthetic distinction. Two distinct ways in which any proposition, if it is true, might be true. First of all, we have to do a little basic semantics, basic logic. What's a sentence? We all know that from English 101. An utterance containing a subject and a verb. What's a proposition? We're going to, by the way, in this class, I'm going to do this in my logic class too, we're going to treat statement and proposition as if those terms meant the same thing. Now, to a really dyed-in-the-wool logician, they do not be pulling their hair out. I've already been there. No, can't do that. It is, well, we're going to use them as if they meant the same thing, and they're going to mean any sentence having truth value. So in other words, a statement or a proposition is a kind of sentence, but with some qualification. And I've used the Euler diagram here to illustrate that. All statements are sentences, but not all sentences are statements. Statements are only those sentences which have truth value. And what's truth value? It's very simple. It's a property of being either true or false. And by the way, if any statement proposition has this property, it is going to be either true or false. Never both at the same time. whenever not either, if it's indeed a proposition. If it doesn't have truth value, either true or false, well, then it's not a statement or proposition in the first place. It's a sentence, but not a statement or a proposition. Okay, so here we go. First type, analytic. An analytic proposition cannot be denied without self-contradiction. And Walt Whitman side, I contradict myself, I contain multitudes. Walt Whitman aside, contradicting oneself is usually what a rational person does not want to do. An analytic proposition is true by definition. And it is true because the predicate of the sentence involved is already contained in its subject. Their relationship is very strong. It is one of necessity. It's not just contingent, could be, could not be. Necessity is a very strong relationship, and that is the relationship in an analytic proposition which holds between the subject and predicate of the assertion. Now, what's the other side of the ledger? Synthetic propositions. Those are propositions which can be denied without self-contradiction. Now, again, you deny the truth of a proposition, you might be correct, you might be incorrect. That's as may be. It's a matter of facts of the matter. So, of a synthetic proposition, if it is true, and it might or might not be, if it is true, it is only true because it just so happens to be true. And if it is true, only because the contingent link which is being asserted between subject and predicate corresponds to facts of the matter. Okay, sounds kind of abstract. Let's give some examples. On the analytic side, I say 1 + 1 = blank. You say what? Well, you can't fill in that blank with anything other than 2 or some equivalent of that, just so by definition. If I say 2 is half of 4, likewise, you can't deny that without contradicting yourself because half of 4, predicate, is already contained in the subject too. It just says the same thing. Suppose I say all circles are round. Well, yes, by definition, roundness is a property of circleness. On the synthetic side of the ledger, today is, well, actually, what is today? Today is, in fact, Wednesday. Yes, I usually teach a Wednesday night class. Today is Wednesday. As a matter of fact, that's true because my assertion today is Wednesday happens to correspond to the facts of the matter. This is the day after Tuesday and the day before Thursday. So what does Jesse Jackson say? Even a broken clock is right twice a day. So 1 day out of 7 every week, if you utter this proposition, it's going to be true. 6 days out of 7, it's going to be false. Again, because of the differential correspondence or non-correspondence to facts of the matter. My shirt is blue. Well, actually, as a matter of fact, this one is not today. I'm wearing a white shirt. I have lots of blue shirts. My wife tells me I have too many blue shirts. How is that even possible? But if it were in fact the case that I'm wearing a blue shirt today and I say my shirt is blue, then that would be true because it happened to be, but it just doesn't happen to be. This person is ugly. Well, that's again a matter of opinion, but if you can settle on a definition of ugliness, then that opinion can be sorted as either a true statement or a false statement. The story about Churchill actually is told by several different people. One of whom was Nancy Astor, who they mutually detested each other. Churchill drank a lot, and he's coming out of this club one night in St. James's, I think, and runs into Nancy Astor in the street. She is indignant. She says, "Mr. Churchill, sir, you are drunk." And Churchill looks her up and down and says, "Quite so, madam, quite so. And you are ugly. In fact, you are very ugly. But in the morning, I shall be sober." Turns out that there are worse things than drunkenness, I suppose. If I say all circles are round, I'm of course uttering an analytic proposition, one in which the predicate is contained in the subject. Roundness is a part of circleness, necessarily so. But if I say that today is Wednesday, well, the predicate Wednesday is not part of the subject today. Today-ness doesn't necessarily imply Wednesday-ness, but we can link the two together if in fact it is Wednesday, today, the day I make that assertion. Someone says all circles are round. I say not. I deny it. I'm not clear what that might mean. No circles are round, or some circles are round, but some circles are square. This is not even wrong. This is so far beyond false as to be simply meaningless. Suppose I say to you, why is a mouse when it spins? Why is a mouse when it spins? Well, obviously, the higher, the fewer. Am I making sense? No, it's not you. It's me. Every word in that sentence is in the dictionary. Why is a mouse when it spins? But the combination together, well, let's say the whole is less than the sum of its parts. Okay. Let's look at some more examples. 1 + 1 = 2. We've seen that all squares have 4 sides. What if I say all red roses are red? Well, by definition, yes, because redness is a property already of red roseness. So the predicate is contained in the subject. Suppose I were to say all Russian teachers are Russian. Well, this is ambiguous. It may admit of one or of two or more legitimate interpretations. If what I mean is all teachers of the Russian nationality are of the Russian nationality, all teachers carrying Russian passports carry Russian passports, something like that. Well, yes, then it's true. Obviously, trivially true, but true by definition. Cogito ergo sum. Remember Descartes, cogito ergo sum. I think that Descartes imagined that this was an analytic proposition. It couldn't be contradicted. It couldn't be gainsaid without contradicting oneself. And in a way, it seems to behave that way. That is, I cannot deny it without contradicting myself about myself. But you could deny it. You could deny that I exist, just like I could deny that you exist. And if I say all circles are round, none of us can deny that. So cogito ergo sum kind of behaves like an analytic proposition, but kind of does not. And so is it maybe a weakened version of the analytic proposition, or is it something else unto itself, another class altogether with the membership of one? Hard to tell. Let's look at synthetic propositions. Joe's bank balance is $314.25. Is that true or is that false? Well, it could be either. And if I say, no, that's not so, I haven't contradicted myself. But in order to know that, first of all, I'd have to know, is there a Joe? Yes. Does he have a bank account? Yes. And is that bank account exactly $314.25, not a penny more, not a penny less? And if all of those conditions obtain, well, yes, then that proposition is true, but only because it happens to be, because it corresponds to the facts of the matter. By the way, Joe may not even have a bank balance. There are a lot of people in California who do not. I first came to California in 1985 from Philadelphia, where I lived, and I went to Bank of America, tried to open a checking account. They would not do so. They refused me. Well, I had cash in hand. I had a bank account back home in Philadelphia, but I didn't have a credit card. I was very poor. First credit card I ever got, I was 33 years old. This is a couple of years after I came to California. They wouldn't open a bank account. I called my mother. She's lived in lots of different places. I said, have you ever moved to a new town and tried to open a bank account with cash money and they won't take your money? And she says, no, that's silly. I've never heard of such a thing. And she hadn't. My stepson came, we moved to Denver for a while, came back to Los Angeles at some point, tried to do the same thing, and he was refused. Also, now in his case, he had a credit card. He had a bunch of credit cards and he maxed them out. That was the reason for that. But in California, apparently it's very common that if you're not credit worthy to begin with, you're not going to get a bank account. So I guess there are a lot of people who put their money in a shoe or bury it in the backyard or put it under their bed or whatever they do. So if Joe lives in California, it's altogether possible he may not have a bank balance at all of any number whatsoever, maybe. All squares have 4 sides. Suppose I say this room is square. Well, looking around, you can't see it, but it looks like it's kind of square, but not clear. It could be settled easily enough. What's the definition of a square? 4 sides, 4 90-degree angles equal sides. Okay, so I get a tape measure and measure. Either it is or isn't corresponding to that definition. And if it does, then that proposition, this Rubik's square, is true. If not, not. All roses in my garden are red. True or false? Well, all red roses are red, true by definition. But all roses in my garden, first of all, do I have a garden? I do. Do I have roses in my garden? Actually, I don't. I've been thinking about putting some in. A good place to put rose bushes is right under your windows. Why put up these ugly bars to keep people out? A nice thorny rose bush, that would do the trick. Maybe someday I'll get around to doing that. But as it is right now, my garden has tomatoes, and I've got a peach tree, I've got a plum tree, I've got an apple tree, I've got flowers, various sorts of things. I certainly got basil in time, but no roses, alas. So all roses in my garden are red. That's false, because what the content of what that proposition says does not correspond to facts of the matter. All Russian teachers are Russian again. Well, okay. If what this means, and again, it's ambiguous, so it can mean possibly mean several things. If what this means is everyone who teaches the Russian language is of the Russian nationality, carries a Russian passport, whatever, that may be true or may be false. It's probably false. you'd have to check every every teacher of the Russian language, make sure they have a Russian passport. If that's the case, well, it's true. Probably not, but it could be. Here's some more examples. All swans are white. All elements have atomic weight. Changes in genotype do not always produce changes in phenotype. Flipper paw, wing, and hand are all built on the same skeletal architecture. True, 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 and true. These are propositions in science. We have discovered that they are in fact true, but they're not obvious. Why would elements have atomic weight? You know, the ancient Greeks had the idea of elements. They also had the idea of atoms. They hadn't worked out the notion of atomic weight. They didn't put it all together. So you can think the idea atom without thinking the idea element. Those are not analytically linked, although as a matter of fact, our basic physical and chemical theory says that they are, as a matter of fact. All swans are white. We'll come back and use that example a little bit later. That was a classic trope of the 19th century biology, which we learned rather quickly is false for good reason. Changes in genotype, changes in phenotype. Why is it the case that there is an observable phenotype which has an underlying genotype which is not directly observable, but which will, once known, be shown to control the phenotypic expressions in one way or another? Say recessive genes and that sort of thing, things like hemophilia, for example. Parents can carry hemophilia genotypically and not express it phenotypically. They can have an offspring who does express it phenotypically, whereas the parents don't, and so on and so forth. Yes, and of course the architecture of vertebrate anatomy, not well designed. You wouldn't win a prize in engineering derby for designing locomotion in animals as we know it, because it's all variations on the same basic architecture. It doesn't always work so terribly well in each and every adaptation. But again, that's not obvious. That's not analytically the case. It is something we've discovered. It's something we take to be true, massively true, major truth about science. And by the way, let me come back to this for a minute. The propositions in science, economics, history, law, all these areas, going to tend to be largely synthetic propositions. Come back to that in a minute. Okay, got a question for you. What do you call someone who speaks 2 languages? It's not a trick question, bilingual. What about a person who speaks 3 languages? Again, not a trick question, trilingual. What do you call a person who speaks 1 language? American. Okay. This is a good example of the analytic-synthetic distinction. The first 2 questions are analytic propositions, and the second one is synthetic. You know, by definition, a person who speaks 2 languages is bilingual, 3 languages, trilingual, many languages, multilingual, or more than 1 language, multilingual. But it's not analytically true that Americans could speak 1 and only 1 language, nor that we could speak English. You know, we almost spoke German. That was almost the official language at one point in this country. There are plenty of countries in which there are several languages. France, for example, English and, did I say France? Canada, English and French. And in some of the smaller European countries, everybody speaks English because English, along with German and to a lesser extent Russian, are the languages of science. So if you're Norwegian or Dutch or Polish and you want to have your works known to the scientific community at large, you need to know more than 1 language. Okay, so here we go. Summarize. Analytic propositions cannot be proven. They are just so basic, they are beyond empirical proof and debate. You can't prove that 1 + 1 = 2. Just as there are some things you wouldn't want to prove. There was a man who used to go around the streets of Edinburgh, come up to passersby and say, "Excuse me, are you sane?" Most people say, "Whoa, I think so." "Ah, but can you prove it?" "I can't prove I'm sane." Whereupon he would pull out his certificate of release from the insane asylum. He could prove he was certifiably sane. Well, that's not necessarily a good thing. Some things are beyond proof and disproof, or for all practical purposes at least. Analytic propositions do not depend contingently upon evidence at all. They are self-evident. They are non-rebuttable. Synthetic propositions, on the other hand, do depend contingently upon empirical evidence. So here again, our synthetic analytic distinction maps over a little bit onto our prior distinction between rational and empirical sources. Synthetic propositions can be debated and rebutted. It's just not necessarily nonsensical or stupid to take any side in a debated question. You might be correct, you might be incorrect, but you're not just talking utter nonsense, why is a mouse when it spins. And as I suggested, there's a point of contact between this question and the previous one. An analytic proposition doesn't depend on any observations. You can be blindfolded, and analytic propositions will still work for you. Synthetic proposition, though, may be subject to observations which render it true or false. Rebuttability. Analytic statements are so massively true, capital T, that they are beyond rebuttable, but synthetic statements are rebuttable. And this means two things. First of all, they can be rebutted. That's what argument is for. And they can be and need to be established by argument. If you go on to take, again, the second class we offer at my school, we're a very small philosophy department. We only do 2 courses. Logic is the second one. Why do we need logic? Well, mainly because there are synthetic statements. There are so many of them. They are so important in so many domains of knowledge. If there are such things as analytic propositions, and there do seem to be, well, then it cannot be the case that nothing is absolutely true. So the guys that say, oh, it's all relative, nothing is true, nothing is certain, that takes us only so far, a Velociraptor would remind us. Even so, what sorts of things, how many of them could be expressed in propositions which are, in fact, absolutely true? Well, I got some good news for you, and I got some bad news for you. Analytic propositions and synthetic propositions each have upsides and downsides. The upside of analytic propositions, they deliver certainty. So if you're one of those people that wants to say, you know, I'm not going to take anything as knowledge unless it's certain, think about René Descartes. We talked about him last lecture in this respect. Then you're going to love analytic propositions. 1 + 1 just always equals 2, necessarily, no question about it. The downside, though, is apart from examples like this basic math, etc., many examples are trivial. You know, all red roses are red. Yes, that's true, but it's trivial. Who cares? Interesting analytic propositions are few and far between. With respect to the synthetic side of the ledger, well, in contrast to the analytic ones, synthetic propositions are just so iffy. They could be this way, they could be that way. Maybe atoms have atomic numbers, maybe they don't. Maybe my bank account's going to grow, maybe it's going to shrink. The upside of synthetic propositions, though, is this. They tend to be more meaningful, and there are so many more of them. And again, in areas like science, economics, law, history, lots of other areas, you're going to find tons and tons of synthetic propositions. So this Venn diagram just kind of, Punnett square, you have to pay attention here, it just summarizes that, upside and downside, analytic and synthetic. Interesting propositions tend to be synthetic, not analytic. Empirical propositions will be synthetic, not analytic. Analytical propositions are true, but they're not empirical. And analytic propositions are never rebuttable, but synthetic propositions are. So think about this for a minute. Supposing you have a proposition which is false. Is it analytic or synthetic? Well, it's synthetic because, by definition, an analytic proposition will never be false. You know, if you can state it as true, you cannot deny it. That's just what analytic means. Okay, so if you have a proposition that's true, is it analytic or synthetic? At this point, a lot of people want to leap to the judgment it's analytic. Think about it. No, analytic is just one way in which a proposition might be true, one of 2 possible ways. And just because you know on other grounds maybe that a proposition is true, doesn't mean you know in which of these 2 ways it is true. Hold that thought. We're going to come back to that presently. I want to suggest that the analytic-synthetic distinction is not just technical, not just narrowly logical. It has very profound implications for how we think about disciplines like science and history and some others. And it also has equally far-reaching implications for the philosophy of morality, for law, for justice. So let's think about science, history, law, for example, with synthetic propositions in mind. There was a time in which theology was said to be queen of the sciences. Here's a mosaic representing theology enthroned in the center with all the other sciences arrayed about her. And the propositions of theology were thought to be analytic. So God is omniscient, might be taken to be an analytic proposition. Omniscient is just part of the definition of God. It's not a synthetic predicate attached to, incidentally, contingently, to the idea of God. And there was a time in which we used to talk about science in this way too, as if science gave us analytical propositions in exactly the same way that theology does. This has changed. Whether or not theology was actually a queen of the sciences in medieval times and so forth, science does not behave in the same way. Propositions in science do not take the form of analytic truth. So if I say, for example, atoms have atomic numbers, okay? The predicate atomic numbers does not lie in the subject atoms. It's possible to think atoms without thinking atomic numbers. The first guy who thought about atoms, Democritus, for example, had no idea about the periodic table of the elements, which we now take to be a very important part of atomic theory. We have discovered empirically that number is, in fact, a contingent property of atoms, and that's a very important discovery with very far-reaching consequences, but it might be otherwise. It simply is not. Suppose I say water is H2O, and that seems like just such an obvious thing. I'm lazy when I write my grocery list. Instead of writing WATER, that's 5 characters, I just write H2O. Yeah, and we just, we don't think anything about that. But again, when you're asking whether a proposition is analytic, don't ask the question whether it's obvious or seems obvious. That's not the same question. Is the predicate contained in the subject, yea or nay? That's what tells you there. And actually, if you think about it, water is H2O is a very sophisticated theory. It is a theory. By the way, theories are not necessarily things which are opposed to facts. So the theory of gravitation is also a fact. The theory of evolution is also a fact. The theory that water is H2O is also a fact. It first of all requires that we understand what hydrogen is and what oxygen is. We understand furthermore that these are gases and they're invisible, but 2 invisible gases in a precise proportion 2 to 1 can produce a liquid, water, which has very different properties. You can breathe hydrogen, you can breathe oxygen, you cannot breathe water. Lavoisier, major chemist of the 18th century, unfortunately he was guillotined in the French Revolution, as they didn't appreciate chemistry any more than some students perhaps might. First isolated oxygen in a glass tube, and people laughed at him. They said, "You idiot! Science is about what's observable. We can't see anything. Your glass flask is empty. There's nothing in there. We can't see it." Oh, it was oxygen. You can detect oxygen in ways other than visualization. I mean, empirically, you can. So, yeah, yes, indeed, it makes sense. But there was a kind of a mindset about science in the past that we have mercifully lost in our own time, which said that this is just silly because it wasn't visible. One can think the idea water without thinking the idea H2O. And again, Thales, one of the pre-Socratics, earth, air, fire, and water, 4 elements. Thales was the one that thought water was the basic element. He had no idea, could not have any idea about H2O, as we know water. Now, notice again that examples in the synthetic column that I gave you before include issues in science, economics, politics. Is there a Higgs boson? We now think there is. Did Homo sapiens interbreed with Neanderthal, Homo erectus? We now think, yes, there are people wondering about, they're human beings, Homo sapiens, part of our species, riding the subway, whatever. They have a little Neanderthal DNA. Not everybody does, but some people do. Therefore, Neanderthal and Homo sapiens were the same species. Speciation is defined by ability to interbreed. Yes, and some of our Homo sapiens ancestors got it on with some Neanderthal chick, or vice versa. And the DNA is there to show us. What will curb inflation? It is even desirable to do so. It's going to be a bull market or a bear market. Is it more effective to appease dictatorship or to nip it in the bud? These are all important questions. These are all questions, however, which involve synthetic propositions. Particularly with respect to science, this is a big question we've learned. So empirical questions do a number of things for us. They allow investigation, but they also require us to investigate. Investigation often yields surprises. Surprises are not things which would be predictable or derivative of pure reason alone, and they are not expressible as analytic truths. So science, it turns out, is the most successful pursuit of truth ever developed by our species, and it is something which does not yield certain truth, capital C, capital T. Both theses are simultaneously true. Science is full of surprises. It's one of the joys of reading about science. You find some crazy things. And this is one of the reasons why you will not hear scientists today talking about proving scientific propositions in a way. Let's say in geometry, you could have a proof. Evidence is marshaled to argue for the truth of hypotheses. And there is such a thing as settled science. We don't have to go back to earth, air, fire, and water. We don't have to, teach the controversy and so on and so forth. But settled science is always provisional, and it's a matter of high probability, which is synthetic rather than analytic certitude. Same thing is true of law. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. The life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. Law is like that. Even the best common sense is not going to tell you how the law has taken the shape that it has in history. So you can't just deduce from general rational principles what the law will be. The law is what lawyers and legislators and often judges have made it to be, and that's far from predictable. You can't get it by pure reason alone. Common law builds rationally on precedent, but the precedent itself is haphazard. Above all, law is not a matter of analytic truth. To rephrase Holmes' point, law is a matter of history. History is like that too. Propositions of history are not matters of analytic truth. This is why you can bullshit your logic or maths prof a lot more easily than you can bullshit your history prof. If you're sitting in a history exam and the question is, who won the Battle of Waterloo? You can't figure out that Wellington and Blucher defeated Napoleon unless you have already swatted that stuff up. You could work out geometric proofs on your own. And again, spoiler alert, when we get to Plato's dialogue, Meno, we're going to see Socrates trying to get an uneducated boy to do exactly that, showing that geometry is derivative from pure reason. But history, well, it's a little harder road to hoe, isn't it? We talked about Kant's categories. Let's come back to that. We talked about that in the last lecture. The analytic-synthetic distinction is implicated in that. Okay, so Kant famously says, he read Hume. David Hume first interrupted my dogmatic slumbers. He got Kant thinking. So Kant got a wake-up call from Hume. Now, Hume's view of categories, which we looked at in the last lecture again, came out of Kant's critique of Hume. Intuitively, it would seem that analytic propositions have to be a priori. The propositions which are true because they are necessarily true have to be prior to experience. They don't derive from experience. Okay, that makes sense. You can't prove 1 + 1 = 2 if you don't already know that prior to working with the concept that's not going to come out of your experience inductively. It seems also that synthetic propositions must be a posteriori, that is posterior to experience rather than prior, based in experience. Hume held that the intuitive view was true, that analytic propositions are also a priori propositions, and all synthetic propositions are also a posteriori. This is his distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact. But Kant comes along and he says, no, there can be propositions which are simultaneously both synthetic and a priori. This is what Hume ruled out. They're synthetic in that they cannot be denied without self-contradiction. They're a priori in that they don't rest simply in observation, sense experience, etc., etc. Things like space, things like time, things like causation, one of the problems that vexed Hume. One can deny that there are such things. Hume obviously does about causation, yet such ideas function as necessary preconditions for having sense experiences in the first place. Remember, that's how Kant's categories operate. Think about Winnie the Pooh. If you don't have a prior category of what you're looking for, you're not going to know whether or not you found it. And by the way, that's not the same thing as saying that you always and only find whatever you're looking for. No, you could be looking for something with a category or a search image and fail to find it. But absent that category, search image, metal set, gestalt, all those things, then it's pointless even to look. So on Hume's view, there are only two possibilities. All analytic propositions are a priori. All a priori propositions are analytic, and all synthetic propositions are a posteriori. All a posteriori are also synthetic necessarily. And Kant says there are some examples which are both synthetic and a priori. And this does shed some light on Hume's problem of causation. Causation was one of those things that didn't appear to be synthetic plus a priori, or a posteriori, sorry. Causality requires three conditions: priority, contiguity, necessary connection. So if you think about this is the standard example philosophers use for once we depart from our example of chairs, billiard balls. Okay, so cue ball strikes the 8-ball. Okay, that's event X, and event Y, the 8-ball moves as a result. You've got priority, A over B, cue ball over 8-ball. You've got contiguity, they touch, and there's a necessary connection. Movement of one makes the other move. Problem is, you can observe the priority, you can observe the contiguity. What you don't observe is the necessary connection. That is an intellectual inference. Therefore, causality cannot be synthetic a priori. Shite. That was Hume's realization. And there's nothing else that it can be. Well, Kant comes along and says, yes, there is. It can be synthetic, but a priori instead of a posteriori. And that's what Kant's categories are. So Kant and Hume noticed the same general feature of human thought. The difference is that for Hume, we use ideas like causation, which we can't find as observable matters of fact. And this is an impediment to empiricism. He's got lemons, and Kant turns around and makes lemonade. We can bolster empiricism if we recognize that, yeah, we have these notions like causation, and we can use them, and they make sense, only if we don't first constrain our ideas to be either one of two categories, synthetic and a posteriori, analytic and a priori. So Hume is frustrated with causation, and he takes it back to the customer service department, and there is Mr. Kant at the desk. What's up? Hey, mister, this law of cause and effect simply doesn't work. It doesn't connect to the events. Give me that, says Mr. Kant. I've got two events in the back. I'll test it, and comes back, and I don't see a problem. Everything works. It's right there in the back. Right there in the back of the shop. Okay. Beware certain confusions about analytic and synthetic. General rule. There are going to be far more synthetic propositions than there are analytic ones. Corollary rules. First, beware of confusing what seems obvious with what is analytic. I already addressed that point a couple minutes ago. Other one, though, is this. Very few ideas are just stupid. Though there are many ideas which are incorrect, but that's the difference. Propositions which are incorrect are not necessarily stupid. Corollary 1. What seems obvious and what's analytically true, not one and the same idea. Oops. Okay. Skin shifting. Skin shifting is the notion that one creature can become another. Werewolves, for example. I looked at last night, I think it was a full moon. Yes. So what's the probability the person sitting next to you in class is going to turn into a wolf tonight and come and snatch your child? Well, it seems to us very little. We don't think that can happen, that we can have werewolves.
Werewolf. Werewolf? There. What? Werewolf.
Okay. But for quite a long time, even educated people believed in werewolves and skin shifting. Even educated people believed in alchemy, the view that base metals like lead could be transformed into noble metals like gold, and at least hyperbole at least, princes kept these alchemists in dungeons, gave them retorts and alembics and various other kinds of apparatus, trying to get them to find that secret. Because if you could turn lead into gold, I'd be rich, right? Well, yes. Actually, given what our physics tells us, it should be physically possible to turn lead into gold, because everything is composed of the same atoms. If you could alter the atomic structure, you could make lead into gold. Now, the technique for doing that might be complicated and might be expensive. The game might be worth more than the candle, or less than the candle. You might actually be able to pull it off, but it might cost you more to get the gold than the gold is actually worth. And then, even if you did do it, what would happen to the price of gold? It would go down. Why do we go fishing with lead sinkers rather than gold sinkers? Because lead is so much more common. And if gold were as common as lead, why wouldn't we go down to Tiffany's for our fishing sinkers? We could just as easily. And diamonds are the same way. What are diamonds? They're compressed carbon. Can you make a diamond artificially? Yeah, you can. It can be done. So industrial diamonds are done that way. What would happen if you did that widespread, well, then the price of diamonds would go down. Why are diamonds so expensive? There's a lot of diamonds in the world, but the De Beers company, who controls the diamond market in South Africa, only releases a trickle into the market, keeps the price up. And then, they tell you, hey, guys, you want to get laid? Better give your girl a diamond, and diamonds are a girl's best friend. It's a real racket. You get a lot of money. Through alchemy, I guess, if you will. And even today, believe it or not, educated people believe that all things are made up of elements and that each element has a unique atomic structure. What a very strange idea. Well, it's not strange to us because it's familiar to us, but it's not analytically the case that this should be so. And they even believe that water is not one of the elements. Wow. So, unlike skin shifting or alchemy, these ideas happen to be true, but they're no more obvious, they're no more self-evident than any other ideas. They seem obvious to us in the way that skin shifting would have seemed obvious to our ancestors. Such ideas may express true propositions or false propositions. If they're true, though, the truth in each case would be synthetic, not analytic, and so would their falsity if they happen to be false. Even if they are true propositions like water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen in 2-to-1 proportion, these are not true analytically. They are true if they are true synthetically. How do you sort them out then? Well, it's really straightforward. If you don't get confused by what's obvious, what's analytic is not necessarily what's obvious, use a definition, right? By definition, for analytic propositions, the predicate is already contained in the subject. So roundness is part of the idea of circleness. And therefore, the proposition here is analytic. If this were not the case, though, then it would be synthetic. It might be a fair question on an exam to say, tell me why this proposition is analytic, or tell me why it's synthetic, or is it analytic or synthetic, and why is this? Lead can become gold. Well, okay, gold is not a necessary property of the subject lead, but could it happen? It could potentially happen. So lead can become gold is not an analytic proposition if it's true, and in principle it is. It's a synthetic proposition. Suppose I say all grandmothers are parents. Well, analytic or synthetic? Just ask yourself the basic definitional question. Is the predicate parent contained in the subject grandmother? Well, yes, it is. Think about it. How do you get to be a grandparent unless you're a parent? Okay. Having children is hereditary. If your parents didn't have any, chances are you won't either. Corollary 2. Very few ideas are actually just stupid. Many ideas are simply mistaken or wrong. That's a different matter. Sometimes stupid ain't what it's cracked up to be. What does Benjamin Franklin say? We're all born ignorant, but we have to work very hard to remain stupid. Are there such things as werewolves, as fairies, as dragons? Well, maybe there are. My wife's best friend believes that there are dragons and fairies. She goes on around with this tedium. If I attempt to deny that all circles around this is stupid, but if I deny that werewolves are there, that's not stupid. And if I assert that werewolves are there, that's not stupid, even though it would be boring. For that matter, the realm of actual creatures is much more bizarre than any of us would have imagined. I said before, this is one of the fun things about science. You learn about all this crazy stuff. Here's a Mexican mole lizard. Here's a Mexican walking fish. I don't know why Mexico gets so many of them. A sea pig, and Brazil gets one, the Brazilian tree hopper. I used to summer in Brittany, and so one day, Brittany produces a lot of oysters. I was sitting at an oyster merchant eating some oysters, and she was pointing out to me right out there and off the coast, there's my oyster beds. And do you know that oysters change sex? I didn't know this. Well, so she put me out of this book, La sexualité d'un plateau de fruits de mer. Oysters change sex, the sexuality of a seafood platter. Oysters change sex several times throughout their life, so you don't know whether it's he or she that you're eating at any given moment. Here's a weird one, the tardigrade, also called the water bear, also called the moss piglet. Very small animal. Looks like it has, vertebrate limbs. It's not vertebrate. Yeah, there we are. Who would have imagined? The Loch Ness Monster. Well, she might exist. Just seems very unlikely. Maybe there are other explanations for why we see that, if we do see that. The Earth might be flat. Isn't that a stupid idea? By the way, did you know there still is a Flat Earth Society? It's headquartered up in Lancaster, California. And if you send to them for a certificate, they will admit you to the Flat Earth Society. You can put this certificate on your wall to show all and sundry. The problem with the Flat Earth theory is not that it is stupid. And in fact, a lot of sensible people have held the Flat Earth theory. There is empirical evidence for it. Think about it. Why should the Earth be any particular shape at all? That's not implicit in the notion of having a planet Earth. The problem with the Flat Earth theory is not that it's stupid, merely that it's false, but these are two different things. If you look at a circle and you look at a small enough segment of that circle, let's say if you look at AB, that's a fairly large segment, it looks round. If you look at C and D, though, that's a little closer to that line next to it, C and D, not to the arc A through B. And if you're standing on the surface of the Earth and you don't realize how big the Earth is, and it took people a long time to work that out, is the horizon going to look more like a plate or is it going to look more like a basketball? Well, often looks more like a plate. So if you think that empirical evidence by itself is definitive, you're going to think, oh, there's, so my eyes tell me this is empirically determined. Once you realize, as we go back to the previous slide, that if you see a small enough segment of an arc, it's going to look more or less like a line, then you realize, oh yeah, okay, that observation needs to be corrected in light of some other knowledge. The recognition that so few ideas are just straight out stupid means there's going to be much rebuttability, considerable room for people to argue. Most false ideas are false, not because they're self-contradictory. 1 + 1 = 5, that's just crazy. Most false ideas are false because they assert a contingent link between subject and predicate, but that this link fails to correspond with facts of the matter. So if I say Napoleon won Waterloo, that's not crazy, except it happens not to have happened. It's just false. If I say the Earth is flat, that's not crazy. It's just false. But that's a different order. So 26 + 6 = 1, right? Do the math. People are shaking their heads. Well, if you're Irish, it does. Ireland has 32 counties. Ireland was ruled by the United Kingdom for a long time in the 1920s. The Republic of Ireland, the counties there in color, got their independence, and the 6 counties in gray remained Northern Ireland attached to the United Kingdom. And Irish Republicans say, once we get those 6 counties back and give them their freedom and join them to the Republic, then Ireland will be one. So yes, 26 + 6 = 1. But of course, that's not meant to be a literal proposition. It's just a metaphor. I guess like girls, accountants just want to have fun. What do they do in the off season to amuse themselves? They do math mistakes, maybe? I don't know. So to summarize, if there are true propositions, they come in 2 very different flavors. Some of them cannot be denied without self-contradiction. These are the ones we call analytic, but some can be. These are the ones we call synthetic. The synthetic are more common and more substantive. Things like science, history, law, morality, politics, economics, etc., use synthetic propositions massively. It is important to recognize when claims are rebuttable, when they're synthetic and not analytic. It's important not to confuse the analytic and synthetic. And the distinction between these 2 kinds of propositions sometimes is treated as if it were a minor technical issue in logic, for example, but it seems to me that it's not. It's much more far-reaching, much more profound, much more basic than any of that. It has some larger implications for the question, for example, of truth versus relativism. Clearly, there are some propositions that are true. So if someone takes the sort of garden variety relativist view that no propositions are true, well, we can see pretty clearly that is false. The importance of logic. Why do we need argumentation? That's what logic is, the study of argumentation. Well, we do because so many propositions are synthetic. We can and must argue about so much stuff. So very little is analytically determined for us. And thirdly, the hypothetical and tentative character of so much human knowledge means that we need to pay attention to the synthetic propositions. And this feature also calls into question high bars like Descartes, for example, clear and distinct ideas, and strict interpretations like JTB, both of which we've explored previously. So that brings us to the end of the talk then on analytic and synthetic propositions. And when we return, we'll take up the last of the three major problems. What is the goal of our knowledge? And once that's done, then we can start to read. We're going to start to read the pre-Socratics, then we'll read a couple of dialogues by Plato, part of Descartes' Meditations, about half, and then we'll go on to Hegel's Mastery and Slavery. So until then, good day.